I think back to those early days with Jessica, my wife. We met in college, both bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, believing that our love could conquer anything. We had that classic romantic whirlwind. Late-night study sessions turned into laughter over pizza, and those shared dreams seemed limitless. But life got in the way, as it often does. We settled into a comfortable routine, something that felt safe but also, in hindsight, maybe a little too dull. I was caught up in my career as a software engineer, and Jessica had her job at the local art gallery. The spark was still there, but it was buried under bills, responsibilities, and the mundanities of daily life. I started noticing little things, the telltale signs of trouble. Jessica became distant, spending more hours at work, claiming she was preparing for an exhibition. But I could sense it wasn't just work. She started taking extra care with her appearance, wearing outfits I hadn't seen before. I brushed it off initially, convincing myself that she was just going through a phase or trying to recapture some youthful spirit. After all, we were both in our late 20s now, and who wouldn't want to feel vibrant? But then came the small, nagging things, her phone notifications lighting up in the middle of the night, the sudden secrecy around her calls. I told myself I was being paranoid. I loved Jessica and I trusted her. Still, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was the day I returned home early from work that everything changed. I had planned a surprise dinner, thinking it might reignite some of that spark. As I entered our apartment, I heard muffled voices coming from our bedroom. At first, I thought maybe she was on the phone, but as I got closer, I realized the voices belonged to her and our landlord, Paul. My stomach dropped. Paul had always been a bit too friendly towards Jessica, offering to help with repairs and hanging around more than necessary. I stood there, frozen, as I overheard her laughter echoing through the hall. It was the kind of laughter that felt intimate, shared between lovers. In that moment, time stood still and I felt my heart race, pumping adrenaline through my veins. I decided to confront them. My heart was pounding, a mix of anger and betrayal swirling inside. I kicked the bedroom door open without thinking. There they were, Paul half-dressed and flustered, and Jessica looking utterly shocked, her expression quickly shifting from surprise to guilt. The sight of them together felt like a punch to the gut. I remember how the room fell silent. All I could hear was the sound of my own ragged breathing. "Care to explain?" I demanded, my voice shaking with disbelief. Jessica's face paled and Paul stammered, trying to come up with some excuse. But there were no words that could fix this. Jessica's typical attitude kicked in, her facade of innocence shattering. She quickly launched into a string of excuses, claiming it was just a mistake, that she was feeling neglected, and that it was my fault for not paying enough attention to her. The blame shifted like a hot potato, and all I could do was stand there, seething. I felt betrayed, angry, and deeply humiliated. How could she do this to me? The woman I thought I knew, the one I had built a life with, had shattered everything in an instant. I could feel my heart breaking into pieces, each one a reminder of the love I had for her, now tainted and cruelly twisted. I wanted to scream, to cry, to throw something. Instead, I just turned on my heel and walked out, feeling the weight of 1,000 emotions surging through me. I left the apartment not knowing where to go or what to do. I drove aimlessly, tears streaming down my face, feeling lost and utterly defeated. I needed to think. The hurt was overwhelming, consuming me like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. Was this how it ended? Everything we built, all those dreams now lying in ruins. As I sat in my car, parked on a dimly lit street, I realized something profound. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a wake-up call. I had been complacent, allowing my life to drift along without truly valuing what I had. I was done playing the victim. I had to figure out a way to take control of my life again. But first, I needed to confront the fallout from this betrayal. The emotional shock was still fresh, and I had to decide what my next steps would be. I was going to make her understand the impact of her actions, and I had a plan forming in my mind that would not only show her the consequences of her infidelity but would also allow me to reclaim my power. Little did she know, I wasn't just angry, I was ready for revenge. Do you want me to continue? After that night, I was a man on a mission. The emotional roller coaster of betrayal had left me feeling raw, but rather than wallow in sadness, I felt a fire ignite within me, a desire to reclaim my life from the ashes of Jessica's betrayal. I had been blindsided, but I was determined not to let her actions dictate my future. I took a couple of days off work, giving myself time to think about everything that had happened. All I could think about was how I had trusted Jessica, how I had opened my heart to her, and how she had thrown it all away for a few cheap thrills with Paul, our landlord. It was infuriating. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I couldn't let this go unpunished. After a few sleepless nights, I decided to take action. I started doing some research into our landlord, Paul. I discovered that he owned several properties in our area, including the entire apartment complex where we lived. It was a small operation, but it was profitable enough to keep him comfortably above water. I began to see a way to hit back, not just for myself, but to send a message to Jessica about the consequences of her choices. I had been saving up for a while, and with a little financial maneuvering, I found a way to secure a loan. I was going to buy the entire apartment complex. The thought made me feel giddy. I knew it would take some time, but I was willing to put in the effort. This was going to be my way of regaining control, and I could already imagine the look on Jessica's face when she found out I had taken this step. For the next few weeks, I worked tirelessly. I met with real estate agents, examined financial documents, and even took a few late-night drives around the complex, envisioning the changes I could make. I was determined to create a plan that would not only benefit me, but also turn the tables on Jessica. I wanted to make her experience the consequences of decisions firsthand. One evening, while driving back from yet another meeting, I glanced at the apartment complex through the car window. I felt a sense of satisfaction as I thought about how my plan was coming together. I could see Paul standing outside, chatting with a few tenants. The sight of him made my blood boil. I couldn't believe I had once trusted this man, let alone lived in the same building as him. After weeks of negotiation, I finally secured the purchase of the apartment complex. My heart raced as I signed the final documents, sealing the deal that would change everything. This wasn't just about revenge. It was also about moving forward and taking back my life. I could feel a wave of empowerment wash over me, and I knew I was ready to face Jessica again. The moment I stepped into my old apartment, I felt a mixture of triumph and anger. I was no longer a victim. I was the owner of this place. I walked through the hallways, imagining the changes I could implement, new security measures, perhaps even an increase in rent. I envisioned Jessica's reaction when she learned that I was in control. Now, what would she say? How would she try to manipulate me now that I was no longer under her spell? I began drafting letters to all the tenants, announcing an increase in rent effective next month. I decided to raise it significantly, making sure that it would hit Jessica hard. She had benefited from the lower rent because I was essentially her husband, but now, as her landlord, I was the one who would benefit financially. I wanted her to feel the weight of her actions every time she paid her rent. When I finally confronted Jessica again, I chose my words carefully. I wanted to keep my composure, even though I was still brimming with anger. I planned a dinner at a restaurant, something casual yet enough to get her to let her guard down. I needed her to feel comfortable before dropping the bombshell. As she sat across from me, I watched her intently, noticing how she fidgeted with her hair and avoided my gaze. She didn't know what was coming, and that only heightened my anticipation. I finally leaned forward, looked her straight in the eyes, and calmly stated, "I bought the apartment complex." The shock on her face was priceless. I could see her processing the information, the realization dawning on her that I was no longer just her husband but now also her landlord. I could feel the power shift in that moment. "What do you mean you bought it?" she stammered, her voice shaky. "I mean I'm the one making the rules now. You and Paul can no longer play your little games without consequences." Her expression shifted from confusion to anger. "Are you serious? You think this is going to hurt me?" "You're being ridiculous." I held my ground, a smug smile creeping onto my face. "Oh, I think it will hurt you, Jess. Your rent is going up. Consider this rent hike my way of reminding you that your choices have consequences." The confrontation spiraled into a heated argument where she desperately tried to justify her actions, but I was no longer interested in her excuses. I had taken back my power, and now it was time for her to face the reality of her choices. As I walked away from that dinner, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and liberation, I knew that this was only the beginning. I had finally taken control of my life, and I was determined to see it through to the end. Do you want me to continue? The fallout from my confrontation with Jessica was nothing short of explosive. She tried to retaliate, of course. Her words were sharp, full of venom and hurt. But I had steeled myself against her accusations and emotional manipulations. I had prepared for this. I was no longer the husband who would meekly accept blame or guilt for her choices. I had a response for every excuse she threw my way. She called me vindictive, and maybe I was, but I wasn't going to let her make me feel bad about it. I had every right to be angry, every right to demand accountability. I could see it in her eyes that she was struggling to face the reality of our situation. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and I relished it. Jessica tried to call or text me incessantly after that night, but I ignored her messages. I was determined to keep my distance, to let her stew in the consequences of her infidelity. I focused on managing the apartment complex, making necessary changes and enforcing the increased rent policy. The tenants were understandably upset, but I was firm. I hadn't bought the place to be a pushover. I needed to establish authority, not just for my sake, but to ensure that they understood I was serious. I met with the tenants to discuss the changes and explain why the rent was increasing. I remained professional, but there was an underlying satisfaction in knowing that Jessica would have to face the music. I knew she would have to confront the financial strain of the new rent, and it gave me a sense of control that I hadn't felt in a long time. One evening, as I was going through some paperwork in my new office in the complex, I received an unexpected visitor. It was Paul, my former landlord and Jessica's affair partner. He swaggered in with a cocky grin, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing. "Hey man, I heard you bought the place. Congrats. But I think you might want to reconsider those rent hikes. It might not be the best business move," he said, his tone patronizing. I couldn't help but laugh at his ignorance. "Oh, Paul, you think I care what you think? You've lost your position of power here. You're no longer in control of anything that happens in this building." He tried to play it cool, but I could see the irritation creeping into his demeanor. "Come on, man. You know how it is. You'll push tenants away with high rents. It's not in your best interest." I leaned back in my chair, looking him dead in the eye. "Let me tell you something, Paul. I don't care if I lose a few tenants. What I care about is making sure Jessica understands there are repercussions for her actions, and you being here trying to give me advice is only making it sweeter." His expression shifted from cockiness to defensiveness. "You don't know what you're doing. Just because you're upset doesn't mean you should make rash decisions." I stood up, staring him down. "Rash? You call sleeping with my wife rash? I'm just getting started, Paul." He left visibly flustered, and I felt a rush of satisfaction. I was finally taking control of the narrative, and it felt damn good. In the following weeks, Jessica began to feel the impact of her decisions. The rent hike hit her hard, especially since we had always shared finances. I received messages from her, desperate pleas for understanding, for negotiation. She'd text me, "You can't do this, it's unfair." Or, "We can work something out, can't we?" But I didn't respond. I wanted her to sit in her choices, to realize that she had not only hurt me but also put herself in a tight spot. She had tried to manipulate me for so long, and now the tables had turned. One Friday evening, after a long week of managing the complex and dealing with tenants' complaints about the rent increase, I returned to my apartment. I was exhausted but ready to enjoy my victory. I had just poured myself a drink when there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Jessica standing there, her eyes puffy from crying and her demeanor subdued. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated but stepped aside, allowing her into the apartment. The tension was palpable, and I could feel the weight of her shame hanging in the air. This was a different Jessica from the one who had confronted me after my initial discovery. She seemed almost fragile, like a person who finally understood the ramifications of her choices. "Look, I know I messed up," she began, her voice shaky. "But I never thought it would come to this. You're raising the rent to a point that I can't afford. Please, let's figure something out." I remained silent, watching her as she stumbled over her words, searching for any semblance of sympathy from me. "I'm sorry, really. I was stupid. It was a mistake. Paul doesn't mean anything to me." I couldn't take it anymore. "A mistake? You call sleeping with our landlord a mistake? You've had months to think about your choices and now you want to play the victim. No, Jessica, you don't get to manipulate me anymore." Her eyes widened and she was silent for a moment, processing my words. "What do you want then? What can I do to make this right?" I leaned forward, my voice steady. "You want to make it right? Then you need to step up and accept what you did. No more excuses, and you'll pay the new rent. You can't just waltz back into my life expecting me to forgive you because you're struggling financially." As the conversation continued, I could see the flicker of desperation in her eyes. It was a cold comfort, but I felt a sense of empowerment. I had turned the tables on her, and she was now facing the consequences of her actions in a way she never anticipated. I knew this wasn't the end of our story, but it was a significant turning point. I was ready to face the final stages of this emotional battle, and I wasn't going to back down. "Do you want me to continue?" The days following Jessica's visit were tense and filled with an energy I hadn't felt in a long time. I was resolute in my decision to assert my newfound power over the situation, and I could see Jessica struggling to come to terms with the consequences of her actions. The dynamic had shifted, and I was no longer the passive partner in our relationship. I felt a mix of vindication and sadness. It was difficult to accept that things had unraveled to this point. Jessica began to adjust to her new reality. She had no choice but to accept the rent increase, and she found herself scrambling to make ends meet. I watched from a distance, knowing that her discomfort was a necessary part of her learning process. I had lost the love I once had for her, replaced by a desire for accountability. My heart hardened with every passing day as I resisted the temptation to relent, to soften my stance. I continued to manage the apartment complex with a newfound sense of authority. I implemented stricter policies regarding late payments and enforced rules that had previously been lax. The tenants were wary of the changes, but I stood firm. I wanted them to understand that they had a landlord who meant business. This wasn't just a hobby for me. It was a commitment to reclaiming my life. Every so often, I would run into Jessica in the hallways. She wore a strained smile, trying to maintain an appearance of normalcy, but I could see the strain on her face. It was a constant reminder of the choices she had made and how they had affected us both. "How's everything going?" she would ask, her voice hopeful yet cautious. I would shrug, refusing to engage in the small talk we once enjoyed. One evening I caught her waiting outside my apartment, her expression tense. "Can we just talk for a minute?" she pleaded. I hesitated, but I knew I couldn't avoid her forever. I let her in and we sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our unresolved issues hanging in the air. "I understand that you're hurt and I know what I did was wrong," she began, her voice cracking. "But I'm trying to make things work. I'm not trying to manipulate you, I just want us to find a way to move forward." I couldn't hold back the bitterness anymore. "Forward? You think we can just move forward after what you did? You betrayed my trust in the worst way possible. You can't expect me to just let it go, Jess." "I know I messed up," she insisted. "But we can fix this if you'll just give me a chance. I'll do anything. I'll find a second job. I'll pay the rent. Just please don't shut me out." It was painful to see her like this, but I reminded myself that she had made her choice, and now she had to deal with the fallout. "You made your bed, Jessica. I'm not going to let you off the hook just because you're feeling the weight of it now." Her eyes filled with tears, and I felt a pang of guilt, but I quickly pushed it aside. "I meant what I said before. I'm holding you accountable. We're not the same people we were before, and I'm not going to pretend that everything is okay just because you say it is." The conversation felt like a stalemate, and I could see the desperation in her eyes, but it didn't change my resolve. I had to keep my distance. I was committed to my plan, and it was working. She had to face the consequences of her choices, and I was going to make sure she did. Over the next few weeks, I continued to manage the apartment complex, ensuring that all tenants were compliant with the new rules. I was firm and fair, but I also had a bit of fun with it. I implemented a new policy that required every tenant, Jessica included, to submit a formal request for any maintenance issues, and I made sure to take my time responding. I wanted them to feel the strain just as I had felt the emotional strain of betrayal. Jessica began to reach out more frequently, trying to find a way back into my good graces. "Can we talk about the rent?" she would text. "I can find a way to make it work." I would ignore her messages, focused on keeping my distance. One evening, after a long day of managing complaints and repairs, I received a knock at my door. It was Jessica again, looking more exhausted than I'd ever seen her. "I just got off work. Can I come in?" she asked, her voice a mix of pleading and desperation. I sighed but stepped aside. I didn't want to be cruel, but I was also tired of the back and forth. "What do you want, Jessica?" "I need to talk about the rent. I can't keep up with it as it is. You have to understand that I'm struggling," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't care," I replied, feeling a sense of triumph at my indifference. "You made this choice. You wanted to cheat on me, and now you're paying the price. I'm not going to let you off the hook because you're struggling financially." Her face fell, and for a moment I could see the cracks in her facade. The strong, confident woman I once knew was replaced by someone who was desperate and vulnerable. "I never wanted it to come to this," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I loved you, but I made a terrible mistake. I thought I could make things work without hurting you." That moment shook me to my core. I wanted to feel sympathy, to reach out and comfort her, but I knew I couldn't. I had to remain strong. "You can't play the victim here, Jessica. You made your choices, and now you need to deal with them. I'm not going to be your emotional crutch." She nodded and backed away, clearly overwhelmed. "I just hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me one day," she said, leaving me alone in my apartment once again. As the door clicked shut, I felt a mixture of triumph and sadness. Yes, I had taken control of my life, but at what cost? The emotional toll of this battle was starting to weigh on me, yet I knew I had to stay the course. It was time to see my plan through to the end. "Do you want me to continue?" Weeks turned into months, and the tension in the apartment complex hung in the air like a thick fog. Jessica continued to struggle with the rent, and I could see the toll it was taking on her. She had managed to find a second job at a local diner, but it was clear that her attempts to make ends meet were barely sufficient. I would occasionally catch glimpses of her at work, her hair pulled back in a tight bun and dark circles under her eyes. It was painful to witness, and yet I felt a sense of satisfaction in knowing that she was experiencing the consequences of her choices. Every time I saw her, I would remind myself why I was doing this. It wasn't just revenge, it was a lesson. She needed to understand that actions have repercussions, and I was determined to let her know that. I remained steadfast, holding my ground as the landlord she had to answer to, and it seemed to reinforce the distance growing between us. One afternoon, while I was in my office reviewing tenant applications, I received a call from one of the maintenance workers. "Hey, I think you might want to come see this," he said, his voice sounding unusually serious. "What's going on?" I asked, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "There's been some damage in one of the apartments, Jessica's apartment. You might want to check it out." I quickly made my way over, my heart racing. What could have happened? As I approached her apartment, I saw a small crowd of tenants gathered outside, murmuring amongst themselves. I pushed my way through and found Jessica standing in her doorway, her face ashen. "What happened?" I asked, feeling a mix of concern and curiosity. She looked up at me, her eyes glassy. "There was a flood and the ceiling collapsed. I lost a lot of my stuff," she explained, gesturing to the water-damaged furniture and soaked belongings strewn about the floor. I stepped inside, surveying the damage. The apartment was in shambles, and I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy. "Are you okay?" I asked, though I quickly reminded myself to focus on the business aspect of the situation. "I'll be fine, it's just everything is falling apart," she said, her voice shaky. "I don't know how I'm going to pay for repairs on top of everything else." I took a deep breath, debating whether or not to offer assistance, but then I remembered the purpose behind my actions. "You still owe rent, Jessica. You'll have to figure out a way to cover that." Her expression fell, and I could see the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Is there any way we can work something out? I'll do anything." "No," I replied firmly. "We have a contract and you'll need to honor it. I can't bend the rules just because you're having a rough time." She looked defeated as she sank onto the edge of a waterlogged couch. "I can't believe this is happening. I just wanted to make things right between us," she said, her voice cracking. I felt a flicker of guilt, but I quickly pushed it aside. "This isn't about us anymore. It's about accountability. You made your choices, and now you're facing the consequences." I left her apartment feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to help her, to comfort her in her time of need, but another part of me felt committed to the lesson I was teaching her. She needed to learn that her actions had consequences, and I was determined to be the one to enforce that lesson. A few days later, I received a letter from Jessica. In it, she expressed her feelings about everything that had happened. She apologized again, and she even acknowledged that her betrayal was unforgivable. It was raw and honest, and reading her words sent a wave of conflicting emotions surging through me. Part of me wanted to forgive her, the other part screamed for justice. I decided to respond, but instead of offering forgiveness, I reiterated my position. "I appreciate your honesty, but I can't change the past. You still owe this month's rent, and I need you to take responsibility for your choices. I'll allow you to set up a payment plan, but you need to meet your obligations." As I sealed the envelope, I felt a sense of finality. I was standing firm in my decision, and that felt empowering. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling of sadness that lingered in my heart. This wasn't the outcome I had envisioned when we first got married. Jessica's response was swift. She thanked me for being understanding and agreed to the payment plan. I could tell she was trying to find a way to come back from this, but I was still wary. Trust was a fragile thing, and it had been shattered. As the months wore on, I noticed a change in her demeanor. She was no longer the confident woman I had married, but instead appeared to be humbled by her situation. I would catch her working hard, saving every penny and meeting her obligations. She seemed genuinely committed to making amends, and I found myself torn between my desire for revenge and the flickering hope that perhaps she could change. One fateful night, I received a call from Jessica, her voice shaky and urgent. "I need your help. Something happened and I don't know what to do." Without thinking, I rushed over to her apartment, wondering what kind of trouble she had found herself in now. As I arrived, I found her pacing the living room, her hands wringing together nervously. "I think I'm being followed," she confessed, her eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing. "I keep getting this feeling that someone is watching me. I've noticed a car parked outside my apartment for days, and I'm scared it's someone from my past. Can you stay with me tonight?" The request caught me off guard. I was still grappling with the emotional fallout of our relationship, and now I was being pulled back into her world. But seeing her scared and vulnerable stirred something in me. I knew I couldn't abandon her, not now. "Okay, I'll stay," I said reluctantly, not entirely sure what I was getting myself into. As the night wore on, I found myself sitting on her couch, the tension in the air palpable. I could see the fear in her eyes as she recounted her feelings of being unsafe. In that moment, I realized how far we had come from the couple we used to be. We were no longer husband and wife. We were two people navigating a complex web of emotions, pain, and lingering attachment. I knew that I was at a crossroads. I had to decide if I could truly forgive her and move forward, or if I would continue to hold on to the resentment that had fueled my actions. The night stretched on, and as we talked, I felt the walls I had built around my heart beginning to crack. "Do you want me to continue?" As the hours passed, I sat on the edge of Jessica's couch, feeling the weight of the moment settle heavily on my shoulders. We talked in hushed tones, and I could see the fear in her eyes as she recounted the events leading up to that night. She spoke of the strange car parked outside her apartment, of the feeling that someone was watching her every move. I could tell it was real for her. Her vulnerability was palpable, and despite everything that had happened, my heart softened slightly. It was a strange mix of emotions. The anger I had felt for her betrayal hadn't disappeared entirely, but there was an undeniable part of me that still cared deeply for her. I had dedicated so much time to my plan for revenge, and now I found myself faced with the reality that Jessica was scared and alone. I resented that she had put me in this position. I had been the one betrayed, yet here I was, worried for her safety. "Do you really think someone is following you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know, maybe. It's just a gut feeling. I haven't felt safe in weeks," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. I could see the lines of stress etched onto her face, and for the first time in a long time I felt a flicker of empathy. I knew I wasn't obligated to help her, but something in me wanted to protect her, if only for old time's sake. "Okay, let's stay alert tonight. I'll keep an eye on things," I said, surprising even myself with my willingness to be there for her. We settled in for the night, the atmosphere thick with unresolved feelings and tension. I stayed vigilant, scanning the street outside the window for any sign of trouble. But as the hours wore on, I found myself lost in thought, reflecting on all that had transpired. Perhaps this was a chance for both of us to confront our past and figure out what we truly wanted moving forward. As dawn approached, I felt a sense of responsibility toward Jessica that I hadn't expected. I knew I had been harsh on her, enforcing the rent increase and allowing her to feel the weight of her choices. But sitting here, witnessing her fear, I began to question whether I had been too rigid, too focused on revenge. When morning finally broke, the first light of day spilling into the room, Jessica looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. "I don't know what I would have done without you here last night," she said softly. I shrugged it off, trying to maintain my emotional distance. "You needed help. I guess I couldn't let you face it alone," I replied, my voice more conflicted than I intended. In that moment, a realization struck me. This was an opportunity for both of us to redefine what our relationship could be. Perhaps we wouldn't go back to being the couple we once were, but we could find a way to coexist and support each other in a new capacity. I didn't want to carry the burden of resentment anymore. "Listen, Jess," I started, my heart racing as I chose my words carefully. "I don't know if we can ever go back to what we had, and I'm not sure if I'm ready to forgive you just yet, but I think we can start fresh as friends. I want to help you get through this." Her eyes widened in surprise, and I could see the hope flickering within her. "You mean it? You'd be willing to be there for me?" I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of my decision. "Yeah, but it's going to take time. I need you to be honest with me moving forward. No more secrets. If we're going to do this, we need to communicate." She nodded enthusiastically, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you. I promise I'll do better. I'll make this right." As we talked, I could feel the tension between us begin to dissolve. We discussed setting boundaries, focusing on rebuilding trust, and finding a way to support one another without getting lost in the past. It was a new beginning, albeit a tentative one. Over the next few weeks, we began to navigate this new dynamic. I watched as Jessica worked hard to get back on her feet, taking on extra shifts and budgeting her money. But more importantly, I saw her commitment to becoming a better person, and not just for me but for herself. I found myself cheering her on as she faced challenges, and slowly but surely, I felt the bitterness I'd harbored start to fade. There were still moments of tension and reminders of what had happened, but we learned to communicate openly. Jessica would often express her gratitude for my willingness to be there for her, and I found myself feeling lighter as I let go of the anger that had weighed me down for so long. Months passed, and one evening, we found ourselves sitting together in the living room, reminiscing about the good times we'd shared before everything fell apart. It was a strange feeling, recalling those memories without the sharp pain of betrayal clouding my mind. I realized that while things could never go back to how they were, we had created an opportunity for growth. As I looked at Jessica, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. I knew we still had a long way to go, but I also understood that forgiveness doesn't always mean forgetting. Sometimes, it means learning to move forward without the weight of past mistakes dragging you down. In the end, we had both learned valuable lessons about trust, accountability, and the many ways love can change. I had taken my power back, and in doing so, I discovered a new strength within myself. It was a hard-fought victory, but one that had reshaped not just my life but also Jessica. As I closed the door to that chapter of our lives, I couldn't help but feel optimistic about what lay ahead. We were no longer just a couple. We were two people committed to healing and growth, willing to face whatever challenges came our way, and that was enough for now.